I'm the co-founder of Swap Behind Bars. We work with people who are incarcerated. We started in May of 2016 thinking that we had a little Twitter spat with a corrections officer at the Lowell Women's Prison. And he direct messaged me, "I hate my organization as much as you do." And I was like, well, okay. So we started talking. Jill and I met with him, and we decided that we were going to do a fun little project where we could send newsletters to people who were incarcerated for prostitution. And we sent out our first newsletter in May of 2016, and in 2 weeks our mailbox was crammed with letters wanting to know who we were, what we did, what is sex work, we've grown probably by about 200 members a month since then. Our people, once they start getting out of prison, we try to provide them with resources. Even with our limited funds, we try to provide them with resources like a smartphone so that they can connect to other community services, maybe apply for jobs. We give them gift cards. We try to get them some hygiene products because the prison lets them leave there with $50 and a bus ticket to wherever they want to go. 30 days worth of medication, and that's it. There's no connection to any kind of assistance. A lot of them leave prison without identification. There's just so many problematic issues that come between the time that they exit prison and the time that they re-enter the community. And it's a very, very fragile time when a lot of people end up going back to prison for whatever reason. So we're trying to disrupt that cycle, and we also are very much devoted to decriminalizing sex work in the United States so that we can go out of business and no longer have to serve people who are in prison for what is consensual activity.
So I have a quick question. My name's Jill. If you guys, this is a clinic, right? How often do you guys meet?
So this is well, these are actually a couple different organizations are here today.
Oh, okay. So this isn't required?
This is not required.
It's just for fun?
Yeah.
You just want to be here?
Yeah.
Yes, that's
Okay.
cool.
That's what I wanted to know. I'm a teacher, so I'm like, are they have to be here? Do they want to be here? What's going on? Okay, cool. So my name's Jill, and I'm a researcher. And I have been a researcher for at least 15 years. I've been doing research on sex work, prostitution, and trafficking for the last 14 years. I am very interested in evidence-based research, evidence-based practices, and how that relates to our policies. And I remember when I was in grad school, I went to the University of Arizona, and I was in grad school when I started learning more about prostitution and trafficking. I'm very interested in power and bodies and sexuality, and sex work and trafficking combines those things very intricately. And I'm also very interested in how we as individuals impact the material conditions around us and how they create us. So I started looking more at prostitution and trafficking because I felt like that was where many people had the least amount of power. I was wrong in some cases because there are many sex workers who have a lot of power, right? But that was what drew me to it, was this issue of power and violence and such. And so when I started grad school and I started researching all of this, I remember hearing about New Zealand. So this was in 2004, and so in 2003, New Zealand decriminalized prostitution. So there's a big difference between decriminalize and legalize. Legalization is what we have in certain counties in Nevada. Brothels are legalized, which basically puts a lot of power in the management, the business owners. They can require people, women, to be there for 2 weeks at a time and not allowed to leave. There's requirements about testing, and we can talk more about that later, but legalization is what we have in Nevada. Decriminalization is where it's not a criminal act. And the way I kind of describe it to people is, let's say I'm a gardener and I want to come to your house and you want me to plant a garden and you're going to pay me $50. And I'm going to plant the garden. And I'm going to go to their house and their house and their house and I'm going to plant gardens, right? And we can have big gardens. We can have big agriculture. And if we have big agriculture, then what? You have to look at the OSHA rules and all these different rules. We have to pay our taxes and we have to do all of this. But there's all these labor laws, I don't know what kind of lawyers you guys are going to be. There's all these labor laws that are already there to protect people. So I can't force my workers to pick tomatoes, which they do, as we know, here in Florida. Well, maybe you don't know, but anyway, Coalition of Immokalee Workers. They're just amazing. And so Decriminalize basically says it's not a criminal act. If you are an adult over 18, consensual person engaging in consensual sex for whatever reason, for fun, for money, or whatever, that's fine. It's not criminal. And if you want to go into a brothel or you want to go whatever, we need other layers of legislation. So I'm going to end this story shortly, but I learned about New Zealand when I was in grad school, when I first started researching, and I thought, man, that's interesting. They decriminalized in 2003. I want to go there and I want to know what is going on there. Is it really this hotbed of trafficking? Because everyone's like, oh my gosh, if you decriminalize it, everything's going to be crazy and trafficking is going to be terrible and all of that. And it was literally 14 years later that I got my wish and I got a Fulbright to go and study the impact of decriminalization on violence and trafficking in the sex work, in the sex industry. And I was there for 3 months and I worked with the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective just this past fall. And I learned an incredible amount, and I'm absolutely an advocate for decrim. And I do it because I think it gives people more rights. I also do it because I think it makes, or I advocate for it because I think it makes people safer. And I also think that adults are adults and they can make their decisions. Morality aside, people will ask about feminist issues. I'm absolutely a feminist. Morality aside, whatever your moral code is, if people choose to engage in sexual interactions for whatever reason, including money, then I feel like that should be their choice. That should be their decision. And by criminalizing it, we push it underground and we make it that much more harmful and less safe. And I can talk more about that. But anyway, that's sort of where I'm coming at it from is, I want to look at the evidence. I want to see the evidence. I want to talk to people and get a sense of what's really going on the ground, and how can we make life better for people. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Caitlin. For the last 9 years, I've been working as a stand-up comic all over the country and talking to different audiences about my experience. A lot of those stories are about my experience in the sex trade. I started as a full-service escort when I was in high school for fun. I like to say I come from money, not pony money, but like, go ahead, major in history. Money. Great. Not a comedy audience, that's fine. You tell me. And then when I was pursuing comedy, which pays an exposure, which is something that people die from, I went back into sex work to do sugaring to support my art. And so I came to sex work from an incredible place of privilege. I would say that both of my experiences in sex work, I was coming at it as a white, well-educated, cis, able-bodied citizen. All of those things contributed to the amount of leverage and autonomy that I had, not just in sex work, but also in every other job I've ever had. I can't tell you how many restaurant gigs I've quit because I wouldn't consent to whatever it was they wanted me to do. But I got interested in sex work as a really young woman because I wanted to confront the Madonna whore complex on its face. We're in Gainesville, Florida right now. My family, I come from a military family. We moved from Germany to Raleigh, North Carolina. I was the product of abstinence-only education. I remember a sex ed, it wasn't great. Didn't take. But I remember back when I was still a virgin and hated it. A sex ed instructor put like glue on a piece of paper. I don't know if anyone else did this, like put glue on a piece of paper, stuck 2 pieces of paper together, and then tore them apart, and was like, this is what happens when you have sex with somebody. You're never the same. Pieces of each other stay with you forever. And I was like, I feel like I would like to test that theory. So I'm also an empiricist. I don't have a PhD, and so I did sex work, and I had a relatively positive, unscathed experience with that. And and I started telling my story and telling people about that as I went back into sugaring, which is like a new word for an old thing. In other contexts and other places, some people might call my clients patrons. There's lots of ways to talk about and think about and frame this. And I kept brushing up against this idea that I was like so special. Like, what kind of mental illness do you have that you would like choose to do this? From like, you're so unique. And I started using my history degree for the first time in my professional life. There's like not a market for it. I mean, you guys are in law school, you know that. But and looking back and realize just how wrong we are as a culture about the stories that we tell about what it means to be a sex worker. And I started to find an alarming trend. I'm a very casual historian. I'm a podcaster. That is why I'm not academic. Like, I don't. My citations are wrong. But I started. Whatever. I started to notice a trend that I think we're experiencing now, and we're certainly seeing here in the state of Florida, that a crackdown on sex workers, whether they are demons or vessels of disease or poor damsels of distress, has always resulted in a crackdown on the freedom of movement and freedom of expression for women generally, right? Because it's actually super hard to tell the difference between somebody who is selling sex and somebody who's not, right? There's a reason that public woman and actress were synonyms for sex work for a long time, and we've seen lots of examples across human history where sex workers were some of the only women in society that were allowed access to public spaces. They're some of our first published writers, and so I developed a bit of a passion of like advocating. Like I'm like the pro-ho person. Like everyone else is like anti-violence. I'm like, yeah, yes, absolutely. Decriminalization does a lot to reduce and mitigate some of the worst instances of violence and exploitation, because black markets create lots of opportunity for abuse. But we see that in legal work as well. There's lots of exploitation and violence and abuse in agriculture and in domestic work and in if you've ever worked in a slaughterhouse, which I haven't and couldn't imagine doing but don't want to criminalize. So I come at this because I want to change the stories that are available to us and help expand the way that we think about the oldest profession, because I think it can help us to create better legislation around it. You know, I have a lot of conversations with people who believe, for lots of good reasons, right? They've been told for 100 years, like Taken was a documentary, right? Like we had the white slavery panic at the turn of the century, 19th century, to justify lots of invasive and bad laws about women in public spaces, and created a lot of the like prison police infrastructure that we have now, right? We criminalized prostitution, abortion, and alcohol at the same time. So I think it's important when we think about the legal structures and the way that we think about laws to think about and understand that history and the intersections of laws targeting sex workers and laws targeting immigrants and laws targeting women and laws targeting all kinds of marginalized communities. And I'm here in Florida, not just because Alice is my BFF and I love her and I'll do anything that she tells me to, but because there's a really cool thing happening right now in this state. There's all eyes on Florida because of Robert Kraft's high-profile hand job.
Are y'all familiar? Has everyone heard about Robert Kraft?
Yeah.
And his hand job?
Yes.
Well, explain it, because I think some knows.
Sure. So Robert Kraft owns a big sport ball team.
Baseball team.
Who cares? And he's a widower and he's a wealthy old man, and he was in Jupiter, Florida. I know that, right? Jupiter, Florida, and there's a massage parlor or a spa there, the Oasis of the Orchids of Asia Spa, that had developed a reputation for being a place where sexual services were offered, right? And my understanding, reading through the police evidence that's been made publicly available so far, when they say sexual services, they mean hand jobs and occasionally blowjobs, right? That's what we're talking about. And Robert Kraft went to this establishment and paid for one of those services. And before that, police officers had faked a bomb scare and used some
Invoking the Patriot Act.
Yes. The owners of this business were like, please help us not get bombed. Invited the police in. They installed cameras, and they spent 6 months recording what sounds like the world's most boring porn. And they threw themselves a press conference, and they gave a big public speech about what heroes they were for rescuing sex trafficking victims. And they published a list of names of the men that had frequented this establishment. Robert Kraft's name was on it. That's why anyone's heard of this case. This is actually a really common practice, the way that this sting went down. So we're hearing about it because Robert Kraft was involved, but I need you to understand that this is happening all over the country, like all the time.
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to say all of this funding and all of this investigation was under the guise of trafficking. So they got their court order to go in and put videos in, supposedly. They got the funding, they got all of this because they look at an Asian massage parlor and they say, oh my gosh, those women must be trafficked. We need to rescue them.
Right.
And then they watched everything go on for 6 months, which is interesting.
Yeah, the part where they installed the cameras, that part of the investigation was after the police officers getting his balls touched part of the operation, which happened earlier, which was the evidence needed to get the cameras in the massage parlor to start with. But we can talk about police officers having sexual contact with sex workers as part of their investigation. That's a whole other section of shenanigans. But there were 8 women that were arrested, no one under the age of 30, and all of them were charged with prostitution-related offenses, and we know that at least 3, is that right? At least 3 are currently being held. Their money has been confiscated, and it's basically they're faced with a choice that lots of people in the sex trade are forced to make when they're arrested, which is cooperate with us on trafficking charges, or we'll keep you in a cage. And for me, that doesn't feel like a good way to rescue someone. So that's why we're here, to raise awareness about the way that these anti-trafficking laws are being used to victimize exactly the people that they are ostensibly there to help. And I'm here as a professional provocateur to throw a big fat rock at the idea that selling sex or having sex or being a quote-unquote whore means anything of any significance.
So we already talked a little bit about the differences between decriminalization and legalization. Was there anything that either of you guys wanted to add to that before we get into? I feel like that's a really good foundation to start.
Yeah, I mean, this is Jill's area of expertise, but the way that I like to talk about it is that decriminalization just stops the arrests. That's what it does. And legalization creates new and specific laws that are specific to sex work, right? This is where you see enforced brothels, this is where you see mandatory STD testing, or in a nightmare scenario, this is where you see forced registration. And so what we've seen every place that legal prostitution exists is that the sex work community resists it, right? So in Nevada is the only place in the country with legal prostitution. It also has the highest arrest rate per capita for prostitution by a huge margin. And only 1% of the sex industry that's happening in Nevada is operating out of the legal system. And why is that? Well, because in order to work as a legal prostitute in Nevada, you have to register with the sheriff's office. That's a subpoenable thing, right? People have lost custody of their kids, right? Because the wrong judge finds out that you were a prostitute. It doesn't matter if it was legal or not, right? You have to do mandatory STD testing, and as Jill was referencing before, you have to abide by all of these like crazy laws or rules. And the difference between like the state law and the county law and like the brothel house rule is like nebulous and strange, and it disempowers workers to advocate for themselves. So like, I don't know, I've walked out of restaurants because they were like, clean that up. I can't imagine a brothel owner telling me to do anything, right? So my preference was always to work independently, and that is impossible under legalization because the burdens of entry are prohibitively high. So legalization maintains all the problems of criminalization, right? You still have a criminalized class of people that are breaking the law. It just adds this like dystopian nightmare element that no one wants, which is like, I don't know, what's that dead guy's name? Right, yeah, well, what's the dead guy's name?
Dennis Hoff.
Yeah, so like where the dystopian nightmare scenario where like the Dennis Hoffs of the world get more power over more women. Nobody wants that.
So I'm really like uneducated in this topic, and so I'm a little confused. Like when you say sex worker and you say sex worker and you say prostitution.
Sure.
I don't know how to distinguish those.
Yeah. So sex work is an umbrella term. Thank you for asking. Sex work is an umbrella term, and I usually define it as an exchange of intimacy or sexualized something for something of gain. Now, that inhabits legal and illegal. So dancing, erotic dancing, porn, camming, all of those are legal. That I would call I would identify people in general as sex workers. They may not identify, many people do not.
Right.
Prostitution, the exchange, and it varies by state to state. In some states, being a dominatrix, where there is no penetration of any orifices whatsoever, is still illegal. Where in some states, it's not. It's decriminalized, right? So anyway, but in general, prostitution is the exchange of sex for something of value. Drugs, money, a place to sleep.
But who hasn't made that deal? I'm sorry.
Does that help?
Yes.
So we may, and I think it's smart that you asked this question, because we may use these words interchangeably, and that may not be the best for understanding, because really what we're talking about here is the issue of prostitution. And I've always told my students, and I've told people that I just talked to randomly, I'm like, okay, I can pay you to have sex with you, no offense, and film it and make a lot of money, but I can't pay you to have sex with me.
Right. And so, the organization that I work for now, Decriminalize Sex Work, has a very specific legislative goal, which is to end the prohibition of prostitution in the United States, which is the most criminalized element of sex work. But we have a larger cultural objective, which is to destigmatize sex work and try to mitigate some of the harms that befall people outside of the criminal justice system, right? There are lots of consequences to being outed as a sex worker that don't necessarily involve the legal system. And when Alex was talking earlier, I wanted to point out that there are lots of complicated legal shenanigans that happen to target sex workers, right? There's like loitering for the purposes of prostitution. There's John stings that happen. I think one especially
Maintaining a body house.
right. It's body. It's just fun to say.
Body.
And in New Orleans, and what I fear is happening here, they actually made a distinction between the misdemeanor of prostitution and the felony of unnatural crimes against nature. What was it?
Yes.
And so
If reversed it, thank God.
yes, but like so I think it's an important distinction to make. So like crimes against nature was a felony, and prostitution was a misdemeanor. And so like white cis ladies were getting charged with the misdemeanor of prostitution and being outed to their families and like having lots of problems resulting with that. But like Black women, or especially trans women of color, were being charged for the same crime with crimes against humanity, where they had to register as a sex offender. And so we saw the real fallout from this egregious law during Hurricane Katrina, where there were all of these Black women who were being denied entry into shelters because they were registered sex offenders for engaging in prostitution. And so like it's one of those sort of complicated things where like the letter of the law and how it's being implemented on the ground, compounded with all of like the social stuff, you really start to get a picture of what's happening with sex work and why it's such an important social justice issue.
It is, absolutely. Alex, can you talk a little bit? So we've talked about decrim, and we've talked about legalization, and we've talked about criminalization. Can you talk about in-demand Nordic model?
Oh, yeah.
Because some people, well, go ahead.
One of the new religion for the anti-trafficking folks is what they call the end-demand model, where they are applying an economic model of supply versus demand. If supply is decreased, then the demand for it is decreased. If supply goes up, then it's a traditional economic model. But that model does not apply to the sex industry. When demand is reduced, supply, which I find the end demand, the supply and demand, I find that to be incredibly dehumanizing when applied to human beings. But when the supply when the demand is reduced, the supply doesn't automatically say, oh, well, you know what, I'm gonna get a job with a company car and health benefits, all right? What happens is they get more desperate, so they're more willing to engage in more dangerous activity. They're willing to take clients who otherwise they wouldn't take. Because they've got to feed their kids, they've got to put food on the table, they've got to pay their motel room rent, whatever it is. So the end demand that is becoming so popular, and that's what's happening here in Florida right now, is they're trying to they're trying to pass some new bills that increase penalties for buyers of sex worker services, and they're trying to get them to be put on a registry for being a buyer of sex services. So they're saying that, well, if men are threatened with the idea of being put on a registry, they won't want a public registry that anybody can look up at any time. That will reduce their willingness to engage in this, and so now we've solved sex trafficking.
The underlying framework that's going on here with end demand, and it's often called the Nordic model, Norway, a lot of the different Swedish model, those countries have passed it. And the idea is that the woman is a victim, the woman primarily, the seller is a victim, so we're not going to criminalize her or him or them, but we're going to criminalize the buyer because they're exploiting. So it's still based on a philosophical framework of sex work, prostitution is always exploitative. And we know that's not true. We know one of the things that I chose to do back in 2004 when I decided to start studying prostitution and trafficking, I'm a community-based participatory researcher, which means that I want to engage directly with the community and see what the community wants researched. I don't want to be the external researcher who comes in and says, okay, you legal students, I'm going to research you. And we're going to find out why you all wear glasses and why you have 8 classes every day. And you're like, what the fuck? Like, why would you want to research that? Why don't you research right?
Sleep deprivation, sorry.
So the other thing that I also made a very conscious choice to do as a researcher, because I think researchers historically have come in, gotten their data, published their books, get their promotions, and move on. And I find that incredibly problematic because this research, especially when it's marginalized communities, the people there give all of this information, and then we get to go make our careers off of it, right? And I wanted to say, I want to give back to the community. I want to give back. And I didn't know what that would look like, but one of my friends, one of my dear, dear friends who is no longer with us, Robin Few, is the founder of Sex Workers Outreach Project. And she said, Jill, would you be on the board? Would you be on the founding board? Because we need people that can put their real names on it. We need the real names. And none of us want to put our real names on it because we're sex workers. And I said, absolutely. I'll be on your board and I'll be your treasurer because I actually know some things about money. And I got in the inner circle of sex workers who wanted to be sex workers, who wanted to advocate for sex worker rights. Mm-hmm. I met so many sex workers, and not everybody was there because they wanted to be there. Mm-hmm. Just like many people are janitors or lawyers or house cleaners or whatever. They don't want to be there, right? So, but they certainly didn't want it to be criminal, right? So my perspective has been always an interesting one because I'm an academic and I care a lot about research and evidence. I also care a lot about where the community is in this process, and I care a lot about advocacy. I'm absolutely an advocate for human rights. And so I just wanted to throw that out there in terms of the exploitation that is kind of embedded in the end demand. So here in Florida, we have it's going through the Senate, it's going through the House, it's been approved. I'm not going to get the numbers right, but it is to basically end trafficking. So they are going to require that all hotel employees are trained within 30 days of being hired. Great.
6 months.
Oh, sorry. Okay, 6 months. It keeps changing. And that's great, but I always ask, well, who's doing the training? And what are they saying? And how do you know what it looks like? And are you going to have people who, we know in the hotel industry, there are many, many people who are working illegally. So you're going to have people who are working illegally as cleaners trying to help us figure out how other people are being exploited in the sex industry?
Yeah, it's companies that spend a lot of resources preventing their employees from unionizing and advocating for better working conditions, putting an anti-trafficking sticker on their brand by going after consensual adult sex workers because we've conflated the two things.
And I would say that the training is probably a good thing. I've asked Lauren Book, she's the senator who's sponsoring this bill. I've asked her personally, can you please talk to some sex workers about your bill? Can you please, she is working with one victim of trafficking. I said, can you talk to some other victims of trafficking about your bill and see, can you talk to some researchers? You don't have to talk to me, just talk to some researchers about your bill, right? The training is I think, an okay thing. I ask a lot of questions about who's done the training. One senator looked at me and he goes, well, who do you think should do the training? I said, I think I should do the training. He's like, okay. But the thing that's the bigger issue that we've talked to Lauren Book about, and she doesn't listen, and we've talked a lot. Sex workers have gone to Tallahassee. I've never been to Tallahassee in my life until this last 3 months. It's just ridiculous. It's kind of a cute little town. But anyway, the registry, the prostitution registry, which they have said will only be for, they call them pimps and johns. Those words are incredibly problematic. But there will only be for the buyers and those that are exploiting. And yet, the way that the law is written, and I'm not a lawyer, but I do study language, right? Is it says anyone who solicits for the purposes of prostitution. So if I walk up to you and say, hey baby, you want a date? I'm soliciting for the purposes of prostitution. I'm trying to sell myself for the purposes of prostitution. I'm soliciting. So we are arguing that no, it's not just going to be the buyers and the exploiters, which that is problematic enough. It's going to be the sex workers.
Even if the legislators that are pushing for the prostitution registry achieve the dream of crafting a bill that actually only targets people that purchase sexual services, it's still bad for sex workers for all of the reasons that Alex enumerated, right? Like, this is not an industry where regular supply and demand economics apply. The people that are engaged in this work out of desperation are still desperate even if there are fewer customers. So if you succeed in reducing demand, then you get the most vulnerable people doing more for less money, taking more risks for less profit. Right? But we've seen over and over and over again that laws that ostensibly are there to target pimps, right, or managers, are almost always used against fellow workers. If two sex workers are working together for safety, one of them will be charged with pimping. Right? If two people are sharing an apartment, if they're sharing a cell phone, or there are so many different ways to frame this sort of like boogeyman pimping caricature to target people that are not villains. And I think that there are absolutely exploitative bosses in the sex industry. There are exploitative bosses in the restaurant industry, and I would like to name 6 of them. But criminalizing the work itself doesn't help you find those abusers. Decriminalizing the work frees up people who are being abused to report the abuse right? Like, decriminalizing sex work does not decriminalize rape or violence or kidnapping. If sex work is decriminalized and you are raped at work, or your boss hits you, or you're not allowed to leave, you can report that without risking arrest yourself, getting your friends in trouble, losing, there are lots and lots of reasons not to report crimes when you're engaged in a criminalized industry. And I will also say this about the Nordic model, is that, this feminist utopia of Norway, where the predominantly women, but sellers of sex are supposedly not criminalized. They are watched and harassed by the police officers because the only way to go after clients of sex workers is to surveil sex workers. And when they report crimes committed against them, they are frequently sent to social services, where if they do not comply with agreeing to stop selling sex, then they are kicked out of their apartment. They are no longer eligible for benefits. Some women have lost their children. I think there was one especially egregious case in Sweden, could be Switzerland. I think it was Sweden. Yeah, it was Sweden, where a woman lost custody of her child because she was a legal sex worker. Her abusive partner got custody instead because at least he wasn't a whore. And during one of their supervised visits, he stabbed her to death in front of their children. So this is the feminist utopia of end demand policies. You cannot criminalize one end of a transaction without pushing the whole industry further underground.
So that's I have a question too about this whole, so we've talked a lot about how this leaves these sex workers more desperate because they've lost John's or
Clients.
right. That's the idea.
Sure.
And so this, does it also affect though now the remaining people who are seeking out sex work? Like, is that a pool of less savory
Yes.
people and more dangerous for?
The best analysis that I've read about this, and I would recommend seeking it out, is a new book that just came out called Revolting Prostitutes. And it's great and very accessible to read. But there are several things that happen when end-demand policies are implemented. And so some people choose not to purchase sexual services, right? These are folks with things to lose. These are like pro-social folks. These are guys with like jobs. These are like your good clients, right? But there's left over a group of people who have either been arrested before or don't care if they're arrested or have less to lose.
Or actually are seeking out because they're predators.
Right.
So, and they're gonna clean up the streets, which is what the Green River Killer did.
Right.
In Washington State, and killed
And
dozens of women, sorry.
yeah, no, you're fine. And as a provider myself, when I was working in 2004, 2005, I was the only person that was criminalized. So I could screen my clients by asking for their real name and references and all kinds of identifying information. And it was just part of the culture of sex work that I was in that they would provide that information because there wasn't a legal risk. There weren't police officers that were trolling for that information, right? I was the one that was afraid. And so they were happy to give me their identifying information. And if somebody didn't, I wouldn't take an appointment with them. If you're doing street-based work, an example of this might be having a longer conversation with somebody to feel them out before agreeing or committing to getting into their car, right? Are they drunk? Are they erratic? Are they nervous? But when you criminalize clients, as a provider, it becomes impossible to tell the difference between someone who's scared and someone who's scary. And so everywhere that we see end-demand policies implemented, and please back me up on this, violence against sex workers goes up.
And I would encourage, I mean, I know you guys are lawyers and I'm sure researchers, but and that's why I've been talking to senators and representatives and saying, can we send you research studies? I'm like, look at the research. When I was lucky enough, one, because New Zealand is just like the most amazing country and I really want to move there. But I was lucky enough to be able to spend 3 months there. And what I will tell you is, I interviewed quite a few people, quite a few current and former sex workers, 66 people in total. It was in-depth interviews. And it was interesting because I talked to sex workers and former sex workers and I'd say, okay, so do you ever experience violence from the police? And they would go, I'd say, the police? I was like, what? If you ask a sex worker in this country, if you ask kids under 18 who are exchanging sex, you can call it is trafficking legally, exchanging sex. Alex Lechnick is a researcher and looked at case studies in New York and California and Chicago of trafficked youth, and they said the number one predatory practices were from police. The number one fear they had was police, because police they act with impunity. They're like, you give me a blowjob or I'm taking you in. And I'm not saying all cops are like that, right? They're not all like that. But because in the criminalized society, they have that ability. And so in New Zealand, when I asked again and again and again, the people that actually recognized police violence were the people that were well over 50, 60, who may have been trans and remembered being thrown in the back of the trucks and beat up. Those were the people that experienced violence from the police. The rest of them would look at me like I was crazy. And they actually had relationships with the police. Cops are driving by. Hey, how y'all doing? You girls doing okay? You guys doing okay? And they're like, yep, we're doing good.